Hey folks, Happy New Year and welcome. Today we're joined by my good friend Hal Lovemelt, and we are going to dive into quite a bit of technical architecture today. We're going to look at the live streaming setup that Hal has put together for his in development Twitch show. And actually, he's been encountering a couple of issues and snags and has been thinking about kind of reconfiguring this system. So we're going to talk about it live and kind of discuss different changes he can make to the system, maybe reconfiguring where the I/O is coming from, and actually what you see on screen now, which may look crazy, don't worry, it is kind of crazy, but that's what makes this setup so much fun and so interesting for Hal to use. So Hal, welcome, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Would you be able to, in a few sentences, describe kind of the overall architecture of the system? Because I know there's a lot of lines and a lot of boxes on the screen, so it can feel a little daunting for people who are looking at it, but is there a way you can kind of talk about it at a high level?
Sure. So the goal with this stream is to be able to do all the tricks that I have in mind and all the techniques that I have in mind, but I have limited hardware. I did spend some money, but I'm trying to use what I have. So it all came down to kind of making decisions on using what I have in the best way, in the most economical way in terms of CPU, GPU management. Multiple cameras, there's multiple inputs going on. Some of them are unique and have to be in a PC and can't be like plugged into a smaller box or a laptop. So there's limitations like that. But it comes from a few like main PCs. One of them is a Zotac mini box, and then I've got a music PC, a music and audio laptop, and then a streaming laptop on top of that.
And from the build right now, like what is the main difficulty you're experiencing with this setup? Because it looks like it's well thought out. You know, it seems, you know, you got the kind of main PC doing I/O and rendering, you got an audio PC, you got a streaming laptop. So, you know, on paper, it seems like that would be great, but you've been actually encountering some issues with it.
Yeah. I think I'm doing too much on the main PC. So I need to kind of split out the instances of TouchDesigner on that is what I'm thinking. And that's what I would love to talk to you about today is how to either distribute processing in a kind of a more intelligent way than what I have, or to find things that I may be doing wrong, or resources that I may not recognize. But yeah, I'm hitting it's got to be a CPU or a GPU ceiling. I don't think it's a GPU ceiling. I'm not getting above like 70% on my GPU, even when I'm running, you know, the crazy stuff. But it might be a video RAM memory. I don't know.
So that's interesting. So, and that's what I was going to ask, because if usually the first place I start with performance issues is just figuring out, you know, what is actually the bottleneck. Because, you know, as we talk about performance, we're always talking about CPU, GPU, and storage. Those are usually the three kind of areas where we're going to get a bottleneck. And knowing which one is bottlenecking is kind of important to determining how to fix it. Because if you start, you know, introducing solutions that fix GPU bottlenecks, but the GPU was never the issue, you're basically just going to end up doing a lot of work and still ending up with poor performance at the end. So yeah, it sounds like from your case, and especially just from looking at the diagram, I see a lot of I/O, I see a lot of outputs, connections between things, a lot of texture sharing, a lot of protocols running. And when I see that, usually the first thing my mind goes to is I could definitely see that creating some CPU bottlenecks, because especially even if you're working in generative scenes, it's pretty easy to know when you're hitting those GPU limits, because all of a sudden, you know, you turn the blur down and it goes faster, or, you know, you change the resolution and it goes faster. And it seems like that's not really the case for you. It seems like managing all the I/O, getting the data through all of these places feels like more of the situation for you. Do you think you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's I/O and CPU for sure. Yeah.
Great. So where would be a good place to start this? Because I know we have this Zotac PC, which, if I understand, is kind of the main I/O PC here. And do you find that one is also experiencing the technical, like, kind of performance limitations, or is it mainly your main tower PC that's doing like the rendering and the audio?
I think that one's a mystery box because I'm running some Zimia cameras into there and they're not syncing, but I think that's just because of USB bus speed. So I think there's a USB issue with that one, and I might just try and offload. So I should also add, I just kind of got the extra hardware to turn my old PC into an actual PC. So I got the the PSU, and I delidded my i7 because I upgraded the main PC from a i7 to an i9, but I delidded the i7 in the process. So I'm ready to take one of the heaviest processes off.
Yeah.
And throw in another Magewell card, another capture from that. But there's still the issue of, getting all the inputs to come in, whether they're each on their own NDI feed or because I'm trying to do it with maintaining alpha channel, which is also another challenge. And so, yeah.
So then with this new computer that you got, that's great because it obviously gives us a bunch of extra hardware to work with. So were you thinking of splitting up the I/O PC's workloads, or were you thinking more about this new machine would actually help split up the tower PC's workload?
It would be splitting up the capture of one of the most intensive camera capture systems, which uses a hardware capture frame grabber, and it's capturing at 120 seconds or frames a second. So it's
which one is that one on? Is that the Atomic?
That's the Atomic.
That's the Atomic.
Yeah. So that getting rid of that actually also frees up like PCI slots and like
oh, because that one also
requires
requires a full PCI slot. Like there's a whole dedicated solution for that.
And a GPU. I'm doing GPU affinity for that.
Oh, and so the tower PC actually has 2 GPUs in it.
Yeah. Now, and I'm going to take one out and put it in this other computer.
Cool. So maybe a good place to start is I've got a blank drawing open here. And the way I kind of approach these kind of things is I just like laying out all my resources available. And then especially, that's probably how you got to this one as well, but laying out all my resources, laying out all the I/O devices, laying out all the audio interface stuff, the Vive trackers, all that kind of stuff, and just putting them kind of in a spatially and visually easy place to kind of sort through. So I'll go ahead and start drawing a couple shapes here. And for folks watching, this is just Google Draw. You can use draw.io, you could use Google Slides, you could use PowerPoint. Doesn't really matter because we're not doing anything fancy here. So we're going to have, your tower PC. That's going to still exist. And that is really kind of, we're thinking of as the main render box as its job, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So then aside from that, we have the Zotac PC. And once we introduce this new system, is the Zotac PC still going to be kind of the main I/O PC, or do you actually want to move a lot of this I/O stuff to that new PC that's also going to do the Atomic at the same time?
So to be honest, this is a little old, but what I ended up having to do is doing some of the capture into the tower PC just because of the USB threshold. But the Zotac PC will handle things like having guests on the show. So it'll be doing the Chrome rendering. Like if I ever need to kind of play anything off of the web, it'll handle that. And it has a lot of kind of NDI outs as well as the what we'll call the VPX camera, which is 2 Zimia feeds on a USB 3 slot. So it is an I/O computer, but right
not the
now,
main I/O box.
I mean, it kind of is, but I could move some stuff over there, but I can't because of USB limitations. So
now, once we get this third, I guess it'll be a fourth because we have a stream laptop. So let me add that stream laptop in here real quick. And I think the stream laptop just streaming is, that laptop's probably not going to do too much, right? It's just basically receiving the stream, running OBS, which I think for a lot of people always get surprised. It can actually get pretty heavy even just to get a feed, get into OBS, set up your scenes, set up any kind of extra compositing you want to do, and then actually like feed that out to the web. So I always think that's a great thing to do is have a separate system just for that. Have big chat windows, and you have it all in a dedicated place. You're not switching around between screens. I think that's a great thing to do.
I
So then
use it also for chat, like so if for viewing chat, you
Yeah.
know.
So now we have this fourth PC. We'll just call it the new PC. And in your mind, kind of what was the game plan for this? So we're going to offload a bit of I/O. So it's going to have like some of the I/O,
Yeah.
especially the ADMEC you mentioned.
Yeah.
What else were you hoping to do on this PC?
Well, we could put the main camera on there, which might offload some stuff, and I could do the chroma keying on there.
Is that VPX camera here on this chart?
No, that's the Canon EOS
The
R.
Canon EOS.
That's camera number one, basically.
Okay. So that might get the Canon, do some chroma key. Okay, so I
Both
think
the ADMEC and the Canon need chroma keying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's throw a couple of extra resources in here. So we know we've got the Canon camera. We know we've got the ADMEC camera. And feel free to just keep running names off for me as I'm making boxes here.
There's the VPX camera.
VPX camera.
There is a behind-the-scenes camera, which is a USB 2, so super light.
Behind-the-scenes camera.
And then there's like, you know, Chrome rendering.
That's more like a web source, you mean?
Yeah, just like for interviews, you know, OBS Ninja, for different things like that.
And then similarly, we saw here, so that's kind of most of our inputs, right? We got the ADMEC camera, VPX camera, Canon, behind-the-scenes camera. In terms of audio, you have one audio interface with a couple of mics and headphones, it looks like. Interface.
But I mean, I think we can, for this exercise, we can just forget about audio, because audio, it lives on its entire computer as an island.
Oh, so okay, so this is old then. So there is another computer right now that's running audio.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Which is nice. It's amazing.
I think that's also a great thing, especially when it comes to streams, like separating the streaming OBS side of things to a separate computer, putting audio on a computer where, and actually, you know, even before this, a little bit behind the scenes, when we were getting ready to record, you know, your main process had some issues and the video was stalling, but because you had audio kind of running through a separate system, we never lost audio feed. So kind of having these kind of backups, I think, are really nice for a live stream setup, because then, you know, even if one thing kind of goes down, there's still something else kind of tethering you to the live stream.
Yeah, and TD Ableton is amazing. So
TD Ableton is a fantastic tool for sure, yeah. So then all of these outputs, it looks like there's...
there aren't a lot of outputs.
Yeah, we got to cut 3 monitors off of the tower PC. And you've got 3 monitors off of the Zotac PC.
In reality, there aren't really this many outputs.
There really aren't there. So give me a couple of like key screens that you're gonna have.
Well, there's the master out, which comes from the main PC, tower PC, and that gets captured and duplicated with the Magewell and sent to like my large TV monitor to monitor the main out.
Cool.
And then there's, aside from that, most of the other out and in is NDI at this stage. I do have an extra Magewell now. I freed up a Magewell.
Great. And those Magewell boxes, for folks that don't know, they're amazing. I mean, Hal, you sing their praises all the time.
They're plug and play every single time.
Plug and play every single. And it's USB, so you don't have to worry about PCI slots. And if you're really just capturing a really simple signal, really can't be beat, I don't think, for anything. Okay, great. So we're gonna have a bunch of cameras. Let's say we're gonna have a bunch of outputs, and what I think we can start doing is figuring out where things are gonna get plugged in. So actually, there is a 5th PC. Is that right? That's the audio PC.
Yeah.
Let me just make that one here too. Let's spread these around a little bit. Audio PC. Okay, so if we get some of the easy stuff out of the way, we know audio interface, audio PC, all that stuff is doing just fine.
On an island.
That's on an island of its own. Great. Now we're talking about this new PC is going to run the Atomic camera. So we'll set that up here. We are talking about possibly running the VPX camera out of there as well. Is that right?
No, the Canon.
The Canon one. Sorry, yeah, that's camera one. So that's going to come
Actually, maybe we could do the VPX camera out of there.
I'm always a big believer that if you can group like sources, especially in a multi-box system, and that's actually one of the reasons why you had this good idea of doing all of your outputs into one NDI 4K stream, because it really helps manage the sync. You don't have to worry, like if everything is going into the machine and you're processing them all at the same time, and you output them into one stream, then you don't have to worry about, these streams getting, if you had 4 NDI streams or one NDI stream from one computer to the other, but then an SDI stream from one to the other, and then HDMI capture on one to the other, all those different pathways can introduce latency, which all of a sudden, especially in the way that you're using a lot of these cameras for masking or doing chroma keys or creating alpha mats, having even a couple frames discrepancy, I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker, but it's not a good look for sure. So I think if it's possible to kind of make this new PC the full-on capture PC, I think that's a smart thing to do, even if it means unloading other things to other machines.
Well, let me ask you this. How do you feel about PCIe USB 3 interfaces?
They're great, I think. Back in the days when Connect 1 was still the most popular thing, when you were still allowed to plug in multiple Connect cameras to a single box. I know those sound like a long time ago because with Connect 2, basically we have one per box. But one of the big tricks back in the day was if you wanted to put 6 or 8 Connect 1s on a single computer, you just start popping in USB PCIe cards. And on each one, you put 2 or 3 Connects. Call it a day at that point. You can just keep basically loading up a computer until you've drained your CPU resources. I think that's a great, and if that's really what's holding you up, because those things aren't too expensive to get, like even a single or 2-port USB 3 PCIe card. Because at the end of the day, you're probably not going to put all 4 ports. You really just want the extra bandwidth going to the CPU that isn't going to be saturated by everything else connected to USB.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a great thing to do here. So especially VPX camera also comes to this new PC. Then we're talking about, we had a Chrome web source, which is on the Zotac, if I remember correctly.
Zotac gets super freed up if we do VPX over on the other computer.
Now, would we also move that BTS camera to the new PC as well, do you think?
I mean, we could. It's super light. It's just a little fucking shitty camera.
Yeah, I don't mind moving it over there. I think that's especially when we start talking about things like sync, it just makes life easier to have all similar sources in a place getting processed together.
Yeah.
Let me bring this.
Zotac is super free if we do this. But, with this new delidded i7, I think that new PC definitely has the power, because if it's only doing I/O, then one thing I just realized is I might have to get another TouchDesigner license.
So that's something that we can figure out also, because right now we're just talking about hardware. Then we can kind of drop down and talk a little bit about software and figure out, what makes sense in terms of just general software setup too. But let's connect up our hardware sources first. Okay. So we know the master output is here. Actually, I got 2 of them for some reason. I think does that account for most of our hardware sources? You got a Vive, but that's probably going to the main render PC.
Yeah. And that's only for control. It's pretty lightweight when I'm not, using it for video.
So Vive's going there. Are we missing anything on this kind of setup?
A bunch of controllerism, but
And those
I
are
don't
probably
think.
going to feed into the main PC, probably the main tower.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's the best bet, especially like controller latency when you're in that very performance mode.
Hmm.
It's really easy to feel network latency. And I think one of the best things you can do, especially like since we're talking about this idea of like keeping like stuff together, you know, if we're going to go to the effort to put all the cameras together on one PC, I think having the controllers as close as possible to what they're controlling is also a great thing to do. And especially like you're mentioning, the Vive trackers aren't that heavy. Because you're using twiddlers, I believe.
Hmm. A twiddler and a twister.
Twiddler and a twister.
Twiddlers, twisters, and valve indexes.
Yeah, great. So those things, as long as you can kind of keep the processing you're doing on them really heavy on the chop side and you don't get into too much like Python data crunching of their inputs, I think they can be fine and shouldn't be a tax at all on the system. Okay, great. So is there anything we're missing right now off this kind of basic layout here?
I don't think so. I think that covers the core heavy, element of it. We didn't really talk too much about output, but I think it's very flexible how I need to output it, because the mission critical output is just that master out.
Yeah. Okay, great. So before we talk about the software, really quickly, like I think one of the good things to do is just start talking about how data is going back and forth between all the machines. So I know, for example, our Zotac PC, right? It's going to have Chrome web sources, guests. We've already talked about NDI outputs on it. Actually, I can make this name shorter. I think NDI is a great protocol for streaming, especially in between computers on a local network where you can wire everything up. That's one of the key things I always say. Anyone using NDI, don't do it over Wi-Fi. It gets very kind of crazy. You start dropping frames. You'll see poor performance. The moment you wire that up to a gigabit LAN, Bob's your uncle as far as I'm concerned. Especially if we're talking this, this PC especially is probably going to be generating, what would you guess, like a 1080p output?
Just a single one, really.
Just a single one, right? Maybe two at most. So then that's
really one output. If we take the VPX stuff off of it, then it's. That could become the stream PC.
Could even become a stream PC, and then you kind of free up the laptop to, go back to just being a regular old laptop. So we can even just put the stream. Yeah, we can just put that down there. So this can also become the stream PC. But we'll see how this works with the hardware shortly. So let's say that this is NDI here, because that'll be sending NDI to the tower PC, which is going to be doing all the rendering and processing. Tower PC is going to have a master output that we already kind of talked about here. Actually, we should probably reverse.
Hardware HDMI output.
Yeah, let's reverse this arrow here. And for folks at home watching, you can make these as clean as you want, these diagrams. We're trying to do this quick and live for your viewing pleasures. Let's see here. So we'll move this guy over here. Now, this master output also has to go back to the Zotac PC if that's going to become the streaming PC. So if this is coming out of that machine as HDMI, you mentioned you have an extra Magewell now.
The other benefit of sending it back there is if I have guests, the Zotac PC was basically, the Chrome rendering one. So if I have guests and use OBS Ninja on that, I need to be able to send them the master out anyway.
Oh, yeah,
Which
true.
if I've got the master out coming to there, since it's a streaming PC and it has way more power than my laptop, it can handle OBS Ninja and like sending them the master feed, and I don't need to resend that, which is what I'm doing now. That's like doubling up the work. So this is potentially a very big power saver.
And I think we can't stress that enough. I think a lot of folks come to the table thinking, hey, what's going to be the highest cost thing is like my art and creativity. But the reality of like any kind of installation like this with lots of I/O, different systems, you can probably speak to this even more, but you lose a lot of CPU overhead just talking to devices. You lose a lot of CPU overhead just sending and receiving signals. You end up spending actually more time worrying about all the non-creative stuff than you do worrying about the creative stuff. Like, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So then do you think this is the best to go HDMI out of this tower PC and then use the Magewell capture card to go back to the Zotac, or would then send another NDI stream back?
I would rather not add to the network. I guess the network has a lot of overhead, but I don't know. That's a good question. I have the Magewell free, so might as well send it over there, Magewell.
We can dial it in and kind of like rough it in as being a Magewell
option. Wait, hold on. Yeah. That's one thing. That is the same thing, because the master output is Magewell into that. If that's a streaming PC now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, I know. I'm being extra explicitly.
Oh, that second wire is a USB cable. Okay,
yeah. This is the same cable HDMI to Magewell back to the Zotac PC. I just put a little note here so that viewers know what this is. So with that said, okay, so we got that kind of setup going. The audio PC, that's going to need to communicate with the stream box. I mean, here's another question. How heavy is the audio side of things? You know, is it worth throwing that onto the Zotac PC and freeing up another machine?
I haven't done any benchmarking. It's going to be a pretty big Ableton project when it's all said and done.
If that's the case and you don't mind having the PC there, I think that's always the safer thing to do, like we were saying earlier. But especially, if, you know, for a lot of folks watching who are getting into streaming gigs and maybe don't have as many computers, that's one area where audio and, like, you know, stream PC and audio PC, that could become one and not be like a really hectic load on either end. But let's say,
I also like the screen. I like that it's a laptop and I can always see the Ableton window at any given time.
That's a benefit, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say that's going to send its audio to the stream PC. And what have you been using for kind of getting audio between machines right now?
An audio interface that goes into the I have a Magewell Pro.
Oh, okay, cool, great.
In.
So then this would actually...
These bad boys. It has an audio in right there.
Yeah. And is that the same Magewell that you would be using? That's not the same Magewell as the other box. This would be the second Magewell?
That is that Magewell.
That is that. So you would actually
feed it into the HDMI.
I see, yeah. So you would actually do something like this, where you...
From the audio interface to the master output.
Yeah. So this would do... going in this direction, and then this would feed into the Magewell.
Yeah.
Let's call, actually, you know what? We'll call this the Magewell. That probably makes more sense, shouldn't it?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that's what you were trying to mention earlier. Okay, great. And this is also a really smart thing to do. I think whenever you can avoid instantiating a whole new device interface, you're going to save some overhead, right? Because we're already paying once for the Zotac PC to interface with the Magewell. And if all of a sudden we don't need to invoke another protocol to send audio, or, you know, wire up a second Magewell just for audio, like, this is a really smart kind of like bang for buck move here, is feeding the audio from one PC, piping it into the same Magewell that's getting the HDMI signal from the other PC, sending those to the Zotac PC. That feels like a really smart and efficient thing. So I think our last piece of the hardware puzzle is our new PC, which is our I/O PC here. Now, this one is probably going to be the trickiest one to figure out, because I guess most of this is going to go to the tower PC, right? Like all of these signals.
Yeah, and the reason I had it originally, the IOPC coming on over NDI, is because I wanted to retain alpha channel. I wanted to do keying on the
Mhm.
IO PC.
Yeah.
So I can't just feed a 4K signal to a 4K capture card. It's got to be like it's got to be NDI or something that maintains alpha channel, which I don't think there is an alternative to NDI on.
It's tricky. I think NDI is probably the most reliable one, and it's really easy to include alpha, which is why I'd probably give that one a test. Now, another option too is... Now, did you mention you had a second Magewell?
With this configuration, I have freed up another Magewell, yes.
I don't believe the Magewell can do alpha.
No.
I'm trying to think, because a lot of the time what happens too is folks should be aware that, like we're saying, not always can you use the protocol that supports alpha natively. And a really common thing to do is just to break out your alpha channel, whether you use something like a channel mix top, into a black and white matte texture. This used to be really common. I don't know if you remember back in the days when they used to do this with H.264s, where the bottom half was... So on the top half of the movie, you'd have your actual RGB content, and the bottom half would be like a black and white matte. And then a lot of apps, like including TouchDesigner, you could flick a switch and say, hey, actually, the bottom half is not real content multiplied against the first half, the top half.
You can also do that on the internet too. I've seen people do that with rendering videos with alpha channels on the internet.
Oh, interesting.
Technique. But also hardware keyers do that. Like when you have a chroma keyer that is a hardware keyer, it just sends out a black and white matte and then a normal matte, and then you handle it how you want to handle it.
So that's what I'm wondering, because the only concern I have with NDI is I find NDI over time, as it's grown and kind of become more feature rich and really robust, also has increased its CPU usage. That would be my only concern here, would be the extra kind of, especially if we're talking about sending all 4 of these streams out in a very similar way that you were doing before, like over a 4K RGBA feed.
Well, I would like to correct. That was my original mission, is to do that.
Yeah.
But I never did it. I ended up sending individual feeds because I realized that the individual feeds weren't cooking if you didn't catch it, if you weren't using it.
Oh, really?
So it's a lower resolution, and very rarely do I use multiple sources at the same time. You know what I mean?
Very rarely or never?
I mean, I cut to them a lot. I want to be able to like switch to them a lot. So I want that ability, because sometimes they go to sleep, basically. I've noticed something like that. Like they won't, like, until you call them and ask for them, they won't necessarily be there. And then sometimes they become dormant, and then you get a little second of lag when you call it.
I wonder, could you use the Magewell and then just activate some camera switching on the new PC?
So the problem with the Magewell is it's only an 1080 signal. So I definitely can't send a alpha channel over the Magewell.
That's true, yeah. So you'd be stuck either
multiple
way.
It's not a 4K Magewell. If it was a 4K Magewell, we could maybe do like 2 signals and 2 alpha channels. But
that could work, but we don't have one of those.
No.
So then I would say probably the best thing to try first is NDI. I think just because it's so robust, so easy to use. And I would probably try going back to this 4K RGBA now that you have, I feel like, a little bit more overhead. Because you were trying to do that originally because you were trying to lower the resource intensity on the Zotac. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or was it on the Tower PC that you were trying to do a little bit of optimization?
Both. But I thought that maybe having just one capture is lighter than having multiple. But then I noticed that the NDIs are not cooking if you're not pulling them. So I don't necessarily know that. I'll have to do some benchmarking.
Yeah. I would say give it a try going back to this 4K in 1. I think that really makes sense. Yeah, I think it makes the workflow a lot easier for you, keeps everything in sync. And I guess the hope would be that now that we have this whole machine dedicated to I/O and keying, and now that we have a whole machine dedicated to guests, web stuff, streaming. I would like to hope that then you'd have enough kind of overhead just to eat that little bit of extra overhead from the NDI always being at 4K.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say give that a shot here. NDI 4K RGBA. And then are we missing anything else on the hardware side of things?
Nothing major. Nothing.
Okay, so I think real quick we could probably dive in and talk a little bit about how you might want to manage the software on each one of these. I think the audio PC is pretty straightforward because that's just me running Ableton. And I assume TD Ableton is on another machine, or do you keep it on the same machine, your TD Ableton?
TD Ableton is on the tower, the main tower.
So TD Ableton's on the tower.
There's a lot of communication that has to happen, so it's a lot easier on there.
TD Ableton is here. This is running Ableton.
The one thing with the software on the main tower is basically trying to break up instances of touch. Mm-hmm. Right now it's running 4 instances of touch. But I think, we won't have to run the capture on the Atomic, which is a huge one because that'll be the one offloaded.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I could save is maybe run an entire communication instance, which would handle all the controllerism and maybe TD Ableton. But that's its own instance of touch on the Tower PC, so that the main instance of TouchDesigner on the Tower PC is just handling scenes and effects and compositing. But
I think that's probably a good direction to go. So the first thing you mentioned was Atomic is going to have its own instance, and that's because that one's running at 120 FPS. And you don't want to run everything at 120 FPS. I think that's a very smart thing to do. So you're going to have the 120 FPS project.
Yeah.
Which is Atomic.
The VPX one would definitely also be its own instance because it's bulky.
VPX project. And then you'd have just a general capture/keying project.
Capture and keying and then send out. So that's 3 instances there.
I think that's fine. I think, while making more instances can make the workflow a little bit trickier and just alt tabbing can be annoying, but especially when our main focus here was CPU overhead from the get-go, because we're thinking the GPU's fine. What splitting into multiple processes allows you to do is essentially if one thing ever kind of spikes momentarily or starts to eat up a lot of resources, then only the contents of that instance or project are then going to start to feel some of that pressure of, the CPU saying, hey, listen, we can't deal with the data this fast. And then all your other processes ideally will be running on separate threads, running on separate cores if Windows manages them well, and then those won't be as affected. So you can think about it in some sense as splitting up instances is distributing among the different cores, but a better way to think about it is more against the almost disaster management, to say it lightly, because then if anything ever gets too heavy, it doesn't impact anything else, ideally. So I think that's fine to run these 3 projects on that machine, and especially when you're on the same machine and we're dealing with a lot of video, I think the best way to have all these talk together is Spout. Very low overhead, scales really well, it's basically direct GPU communication. So I think that would be great if you could do that on this machine. Does that sound like that would work out for this machine?
Yes, Spout sounds lovely.
Spout communication here. Okay, so then on the main PC, what are the different so we're talking about one that could be for controllers.
Just like data, all the data. The Vive is kind of heavy, so that would go into the controllers.
So you do have a lot of processing happening on the Vive information coming in?
Yeah.
Okay, so
the thing that stresses me out about this would be handling all the communication and triggering in between processes and building a whole infrastructure around that. But it'd probably be worth it for controller to get the controllerism off of there.
Would you also put the TD Ableton into that same data project?
See, I could. Probably should.
I think it would make sense, especially if you're already offloading everything like controllers, Vive trackers. TD Ableton in my mind is really just a giant control patch, right? It's getting a lot of data from Ableton on the other PC, parsing it and preparing it, and you're basically just doing this big communication pipe. So I think if you're going to go ahead and make a data project, you might as well put TD Ableton in there as well.
Yeah. And then handle the triggers and the inputs and outs with a touch in and out, and then like UDP signals or something.
Yeah, I would say touch in and out chops can be really great for that kind of thing. They're basically running on top of UDP, so it's super fast, super lightweight. If you really wanted, you could use OSC in and out chops, because it sounds like most of that is going to be channel data. Is that right? I guess TD Ableton might have some string data.
I have like
maybe?
specific triggers that would go to TD Ableton that are text-based, so I'd want to be able to like maybe just do that over a DAT. It's just a DAT communication protocol of some kind.
So there's a couple ways you could do that depending on how much time you want to spend on it. Like the easiest way would be you could use something like a touch in and out DAT. Basically send the table in there from your sending project, and that's where you basically just write the command you want into a table. And then on the receiving end, you could do something like have a DAT execute that just watches that table, and as these new commands come through, very simple Python scripting, do some if-else statements and say, okay, well, if the command is this, do this. If it's this, do this, etc., etc.
Yeah.
I think that would probably work out well. If you wanted to build it up a little bit better, obviously you could make something like UDP in and out DAT and then start sending JSON packages or any other kind of like formatted strings that you want to send. But this system is already complicated enough, so I wouldn't blame you for just like, hey, you know what? I just wanted to try and see if some touch in and out DATs will work.
Yeah, especially if I could just use global op shortcuts and just be like, op da 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 da. So I've written what it does. Yeah.
So then that'll be one project, and then you're going to have the main render project as kind of its own project. So that's main render project. Is there anything else that needs to kind of run on that? Because I guess the main render project would be communicating with the Magewell, receiving the NDI. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So I think that covers. Is that? Sorry?
It's only one out.
It's only one out. Make it sound so simple. It's only one out.
Yeah.
And then the Zotac PC, which is now also the streaming PC, so that's going to have OBS running on it. Were you going to do web playback and sources probably inside of OBS as browser sources, or were you going to do them in TouchDesigner as kind of web render tops?
So this is where things get interesting. If somehow I can get the Zotac PC to not require a TouchDesigner instance or license, then I can save $600. So if I use OBS and NDI tools and just did everything on there, was basically just like meant for full screening, and you don't need to do any kind of TouchDesigner projects, then that would be perfect, actually.
I don't see why not, because for example, if we're talking about this functioning as a streaming PC, I mean, that's all going to happen in OBS anyways. If we're talking about web playback, you just drop some browser sources into the OBS. We're talking about guests. I mean, even we're recording this right now through OBS, and you're kind of talking to me through OBS Ninja. And what I've seen that's a really smart thing that Matthew actually showed me was what you can do is run multiple instances of OBS very easily, and then basically dedicate some of them to certain things. And that allows you to take advantage of stuff like the OBS virtual camera. So you could have one OBS patch that's open that's basically like your input OBS project, and that's doing stuff like getting web playback streams, getting OBS Ninja streams for guests, doing any compositing for that, and then you turn on the OBS virtual cam on that instance, capture it in your kind of streaming and output instance, and basically just that one does the compositing, deals with chat and getting any of the stream information, and then you can still use OBS without getting two kind of Rube Goldberg inside of one OBS app. Yeah, you can nicely split it up between two. So I think that may be a good way to approach the Zotac PC. Because like you said, getting another TouchDesigner license does end up being a reach into the pocket a lot of the time. So if we can avoid that sometimes, it's a nice thing to do. So I think with that said, we have a pretty good layout here. Are there any kind of concerns you have looking at this kind of at a high level?
Finding the time to make it happen.
Ba-doom.
No, I think this is incredibly exciting because it solves a lot of problems. And
And it looks, to me, kind of just looking at it, I mean, it's definitely hideous. Let's not get wrong here. Like, your old one was very nice, curved, you know, connections, beautifully rounded boxes. But this one definitely feels a little bit simpler to me, and at least kind of more compartmentalized, where certain computers are doing certain things fully. You know, one of the tricky parts, even when we were discussing your setup previously, was that, you know, a couple cameras are coming into one system, another camera's in another system. You got to get them talking. You know, all these computers have different outputs. It kind of was becoming a bit spider webby. And this one feels like really the systems have dedicated jobs. And those jobs not only should make it easier for you to kind of set up those systems, also maintain those systems, work with those systems, manage the systems. Seems like overall it should be like a lot easier to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on, my friend. Thanks for chatting to us
Thanks
about your
for
setup.
having me.
No problem.
Thanks
My pleasure. And for folks that are watching, you know, this process that we're going through, it looks kind of messy and dirty, but it's a really important thing as you're especially building bigger and bigger systems. You know, open a little diagram, make some napkin drawings, just kind of lay everything out and kind of play that game of Tetris and see how can I group like-minded processes together, how can I distribute workflows in a way that doesn't, you know, because if we had 4 systems and every system had a camera, that might be the most optimal optimization possible, but I could guarantee you it would make your working life very difficult, and having a system like this is going to make working a lot easier. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoy, and we'll see you on the next one. Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you're serious about learning TouchDesigner and getting into our interactive and immersive industry, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can click the link in the description to learn more about that. And if you liked this video, hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and click on the little bell icon for more awesome free content.